Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Doug Lowy. I am the acting director of the National Cancer Institute, and I want to thank you for joining uh, this session, which is to discuss doubling accrual to cancer clinical trials. Before we go forward, I want to tell you about a few housekeeping issues. This discussion is being live streamed via YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you experience difficulty with one platform, you may want to switch to one of the others. However, the discussion is also being recorded and will be available for viewing later. This conversation is one of several that are being conducted today by the agencies participating in the administration's cancer cabinet on behalf of the White House. And this is illustrative of what President Biden calls this whole of government approach. If we could have the first slide, please. I have just a couple of introductory slides where overall the goal of the Cancer Moonshot is to end cancer as we know it. The next slide shows you that there really are three major components. One is to cut the cancer death rate in half within the next 25 years. The second is to transform the meaning of cancer. And the third, to address cancer associated inequities. Cancer clinical trials really cover all of these areas and are critical to all three of these areas. And it's why we are emphasizing for this roundtable discussion the importance of clinical trials and their accrual. Next slide. And this slide introduces you to the participants. Joaquina Baranda, who is from the University of Kansas Medical Center, is joining us. Susan Galbraith, Vice President of Oncology at AstraZeneca. Kathy Giusti, who is the founder of the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, has not been able to join immediately, but she may be able to join later. Robert Manol, who is the director of the Stevenson Cancer Center at the University of Oklahoma, is here. Phyllis Petty-Nassi, who is from the Huntsman Cancer Institute at the University of Utah, is participating. Augusto Ochoa from the LSU Health New Orleans School of Medicine is with us. And last but certainly not least, Corey Painter, who is from the Broad Institute and the Associate Director of Count Me In. I'm going to turn the moderating of the meeting over to my colleague, Dr. Jim Doroshow, who is the Deputy Director of Clinical and Translational Research at NCI, who will be moderating this discussion.
Thanks so much, Doug. Could I have the next slide? I thought that to get started, we might just go over some recent numbers. And these are data that reported to the NCI's Cancer Clinical Trials Reporting Program, basically a system in which we collect from the NCI-designated cancer centers their accrual to all forms of cancer trials, including cancer treatment trials. And so this is for the calendar year 2019, pre-COVID figures, which show us that about 60,000 patients were accrued across our NCI-designated cancer centers. And the mixture is about 30% institutional trials, about 30% to our NCORE and NCTN trials, about 6% that are externally peer-reviewed. And I want to point out that the 33% that we have for noted for industrial trials only includes the accrual that goes on at the 60 plus NCI designated cancer centers that conduct those studies at those sites. It's not representative of the total accrual to pharmaceutically sponsored trials in 2019. That number is not something that is routinely reported to us. So we have a pretty big number, a number that has been relatively stable for the past several years. This number does not include cancer prevention trials, screening trials, real-world evidence trials. These are studies that are specifically oriented to cancer treatment, and we present it because we think these numbers are really pretty firm in terms of where we stand today. Next slide. So let me ask all of you to begin this dialogue with us about our clinical trials enterprise and how doubling clinical trials accrual as a goal for the future might contribute to meeting one or more of President Biden's moonshot goals. And how could we do this with an emphasis on increasing participation from minority and underserved populations? So let me open with that very broad set of questions and ask our panelists to take their best shot.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. I'd like to thank the NCI for inviting me in this very important discussion. As a medical oncologist, this is extremely important to us, particularly that I serve at the University of Kansas Cancer Center, which is the only NCI designated cancer center in the region. And our catchment area is actually composed of mainly rural cancer patients and patients who belong to geography where it's considered to be HPSA or health professional shortage area for primary care. So this initiative is extremely exciting for us because years ago, when you talk to patients about going into clinical trials, the nurses, everybody around you during rounds will say, well, they live 3 hours away, they live 4 hours away. So immediately those patients are not considered for clinical trials. So I think this is an extremely important initiative to double the clinical trial participation. And I actually think we can do it. It just needs, it takes all hands on deck. And I would like to share our experience with the catch-up program that was an NCI initiative that you, Dr. Doroshow, actually thought about. And with that, we actually used several strategies that proved to us that we can actually do this. We not just doubled our accrual to ETCT and trials from some of the strategies we did, but we actually increased it by 5-fold or so. I think leadership, strong leadership and alignment from the leadership is core to this initiative. Roy Jensen was very strong and was able to align everybody in the cancer center and say that we need to put patients on clinical trials. And I have other things to share later, but those are the important points that I'd like to say.
This is Nancy. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add to what Dr. Baranda was saying. I work at the Huntsman Cancer Institute in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I'm an enrolled member of the Oto Missouri Tribe and member of the Cherokee Nation. The catchment area for the Huntsman Cancer Institute is 5 states, and we are predominantly rural and frontier. And the change that is going to need to take place in order to double our accrual into the clinical trials is going to be a commitment to maybe fail, because by failing, we will learn what we need to do in order to reach that goal, and trying and making sure that we attempt to get out to rural and frontier populations and to support those clinics and physicians that are in those areas. Thank you.
This is Corey Painter. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation. And I'm going to add to this conversation from the perspective of somebody with an exceedingly rare cancer. I was diagnosed with angiosarcoma 12 years ago today. And I was already a scientist at the time. And the first thing that flooded my mind was there's no hope for me, and there's no hope for anybody to get my rare cancer or any other rare cancer ever, because we are too spread apart to ever have a clinical focus. And I think that we're at a moment in time now where we know we can overcome geographic dispersion. We know we can reach out to folks in community and rural settings. And I think the time is now to really think about doubling down on our efforts to bring trials to patients, not just to overcome these barriers, but to overcome all of the financial toxicity that goes along with trials that patients have to travel to, and the discomfort of having to travel and leave your family, your caregiver, and your loved ones behind.
This is Robert Manol, and one of my roles is I'm one of the chairs of the NRG, National Clinical Trials Network Cooperative Group. It's obviously a passion of mine to support large clinical trials, practice-defining trials, for us to achieve President Biden's wishes. You're absolutely right, Dr. Dorschau. It's going to require a robust, effective clinical trials presence, and doubling patients on clinical trials is a great goal to achieve the others. Now, in my research over the years, we've identified 4 barriers to participation on clinical trials. The first of those is the protocol itself, eligibility criteria being too stringent and marginalizing people. It started with age restrictions. Nobody over 70 could go on a trial, etc. Those have been drastically improved over the past couple of decades. In the most recent initiative, I applaud the NCI at working with ASCO to really look at barriers to protocol eligibility, and we need to continue with that. The second is healthcare provider barriers. We all have our implicit bias that has been mentioned by others, that this patient really can't go on a trial because they don't have the right insurance, or they're uninsured, or they live too far away, or they speak a different language. We have to stop, and we have to recognize that that is actually our problem, not the patient's problem. And we have to overcome those implicit biases. We have to become passionate about clinical trials. We have to believe the NCCN guidelines that say the best treatment for any cancer patient is on a clinical trial. If we're oncologists and we believe in the NCCN guidelines, and we're a nurse or a clinical trials coordinator or a healthcare delivery system, that means we're going to have to invest in that. That's critical. And I don't think that message is as strong as it needs to be. There are real patient barriers. Like others have mentioned, I live in a relatively poor state, Oklahoma, very rural state, and we have huge health disparities amongst our American Indian and African American population. One of the first things that we realized was you have to meet the patient where they are in order to do a successful clinical trial. We screen all of our patients for social determinants of health barriers, but we go beyond that. We just don't screen them, then we do something about it. We have to provide transportation. We have to use mobile health technology. We have to provide food. We have a food pantry in our cancer center because 15% of our patients are food insecure. If I'm food insecure, you start talking about a clinical trial to me, I'm not even sure I can make the next appointment. Transportation, housing, financial toxicity, social workers, financial navigators, philanthropy, programs to alleviate that type of toxicity are critical. So I think that that's another barrier. And then the final barrier is the healthcare system barrier, and that is for a lot of clinical trials, the funding that is received, I'm also the director of an NCI designated cancer center, does not cover the cost of doing the trial. And that's particularly true for the NCI sponsored trials. We're all passionate, we all want to do the right thing, but that level of funding is below break-even point. And there's multiple studies that have looked at this. So I think if we're going to address this very, very critical point to double the amount of enrollment, we need to look at all four of those factors, address each of them, hold ourselves accountable, whether it's at the individual provider level, the healthcare delivery system level, the NCI level. All those things are critical. So I really appreciate this is a great opportunity for us to elevate the importance of this. And once again, and I know I'm speaking to the choir here with Dr. Lowy and Dr. Dorshow, but all the great science and all the great efforts that we do in our laboratories will stay there unless we have an effective and robust clinical trial system that can move those ideas into patient care. That's what's altered the landscape of cancer survivorship over the past 50 years. That's what's going to alter it in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much once again.
So let me intervene because we all have lots to say, but we have some other questions I'd like to cover, and yeah, you'll have a chance to make your points. But before we stop, Robert, I have to say, I know you know, but I'm not sure everybody else knows, that the University of Oklahoma, located in Manhattan, actually was by far and away the largest accruer to the NCI match trial by hundreds of patients among all the thousands of sites that we had. So congratulations, you've obviously made it work where you are, and we're very appreciative of your efforts and your insights. So could we perhaps move on to another question, and there'll be many chances to contribute, but I'm very interested to hear from this group what they've tried, what's been successful, and what hasn't been successful to increase participation, in particular, increase participation for underserved patients.
So this is Augusto Ochoa from LSU. As you know, Louisiana and the Gulf South is one of the epicenters of cancer incidence and mortality. And although we're not an NCI designated cancer center, we built our clinical trials program based on the NCORP. And by serendipity, 15 years ago, we decided to move it out into real community partnerships. Our NCORP that's had originally one site located in New Orleans eventually developed through a partnership with 5 other institutions, and we now have 49 sites throughout the state of Louisiana and Mississippi. And that has allowed us to increase by 6-fold the number of patients that we were enrolling in clinical trials, and not only increase the number of patients, but increase the percentage of minority participation, up to 55% of our patients. So I think one of the important things, the lessons that came out of this was that we needed to ensure that we developed a partnership with community oncologists. Community oncologists see and treat the majority of cancer patients in the United States. They're not treated by academic cancer centers or NCI designated centers. It's the community oncologists. They are eager to participate. We just need to make it easier. And I think, as Dr. Manol was saying, we need to make clinical trials appropriate so that we can enroll real world oncology patients that have other comorbidities and not exclude them from clinical trials. I'll leave it there. And again, thanks, Jim and Doug, for inviting us. I'll add more as we go in the discussion.
So this is Susan Galbraith from AstraZeneca, and again, I appreciate being invited to this panel as a representative of industry more generally. So in terms of including more diverse patients in our clinical trials, this is something that is increasingly important. And I think one of the things that will help to further improve on where we currently are, and where we are is not ideal, but there are several trials that we've had that we've been able to include an appropriate diversity of patients in. One thing that will help is the regulatory expectation, and that is coming increasingly from the FDA. So I think that's a good thing to see. Secondly, I think the points that's already been made about finding ways to enable patients to access clinical trials closer to their homes, closer to where they are, is really important. And so I think these community networks that are connected to academic centers can be really helpful in that regard. Thirdly, I think in terms of training the staff at the community centers and from diverse backgrounds, we've, for example, partnered with Parexel to train Hispanic doctors and staff to expand the community reach and build trust and awareness. And when we were running some of the COVID-19 clinical trials, we utilized mobile units to build awareness close to the site in the more remote areas. Those are techniques that have been shown to be effective, and we should be leveraging more generally. I think expanding the criteria for reimbursement for travel and participation and potential use of digital devices as well is something that can provide access, because that means that we can then reduce the patient burden measured by the number of visits and the burdensome requests at visits of tests, etc. We can do that. We're measuring that within our clinical trials, and we've been able to have a 25% reduction in the patient burden measured across our clinical trials by starting to track that. But quite often it requires training and education and access to digital devices, which is something that I think the regulatory flexibility to allow that will help increase that diversity over time. And then finally, I think in terms of investment in expanding the clinical trial infrastructure, again, it's about training and education of the investigator network across community centres, as well as patients about the opportunities and the fact that they can access the best care, as another speaker's already pointed out, by participating in clinical trials. And those navigators, I think, are key. So what I would just say is that industry wants to be a key partner in enabling this. It's good for all of us. It will speed the answers to the key questions in terms of how we improve on cancer care. And I think it's critically important. So anything we can do to help, we're willing to do so.
This is Corey Painter. Sorry, I'll just be quick. I just want to expand on some of the themes that are emerging here in terms of bringing trials to places where there is better access. And along that, with respect to enrollment of underserved populations, ensuring that you are leveraging the trust bearers within those communities to really help with enrollment is critical. We don't do clinical trials at my work with Count Me In, but we do enrollment in a clinical context. And we've done a lot of community engagement and have learned through the years by talking with a number of cancer patients that there's obviously a lot of mistrust that needs to be overcome, but there's a lot of people in the medical industry that are trust carriers. And so bringing them deeply into the process, not after the fact, but as trials are being designed, and patients themselves as they're being designed will should absolutely help make sure that the clinical trials are reflective of the patients that you're trying to serve.
Following what Corey Painter has just said, there is over 75% of the American Indian and Alaska Native population that does not live on reservations and are in urban and rural areas. And so the question that we have to figure out is, why are we not reaching those populations, one? And two, the successes of, for example, the Black Hills Center for American Indian Health that is run by Dr. Jeffrey Henderson and Dr. Patricia Nez Henderson has shown that it is successful in recruiting those populations, those Native American populations in the Dakotas to clinical trials. And so we have to take a look at what they are doing, because this is a population that is very difficult to reach for historical reasons. And what we were doing at Huntsman, and this started about 15, maybe 18 years ago, when I was given the charge of increasing enrollment. At that time, there was funding for outreach programs. And so once given that charge, we were able to go out and talk about clinical trials, educate about clinical trials, because someone cannot ask for something that they don't know about, nor can they, are you really willing to participate in something that you don't understand? And if we can continue to do outreach and education in rural and frontier areas. And it's not just for the American Indian Alaska Native populations, it's for the ranchers, for the farmers, for the Hutterites, for small town USA. Those areas are just as difficult to break into as many ethnic and minority populations are, because we're missing a large swath of patients who live in these areas, because the clinical trials focus accrual predominantly in urban and suburban populations. And then making sure that we continue the education process of the underserved populations and bringing them into the research field and bringing them into cancer centers, because at a cancer center, it's not just the researcher that is important. It takes a lot of different types of people. It takes a lot of different qualifications, and not just principal investigators and not just physicians in order to make this work. And being able to see clinical trials with different eyes is going to help those patients that we want to reach and that we need to reach have the capacity to enter into a clinical trial with confidence.
I would just like to expand on that a little bit. I think you hit some really strong points. At our particular center, 40% of our patients come from 50 miles or greater away. And 40% of the patients diagnosed in the state of Oklahoma live in federally designated rural counties. So we do need to address that. I will say 40% of the patients that go on clinical trial at our center are from those counties. There is no difference in enrollment rates between urban and rural or between any of our minority populations. But it goes back to what's been said. I think this is critical. It's not about a physician or a person on an island making this happen. You have to have the whole system behind it. I think that's been mentioned a couple of times. And the first thing you have to do is you have to do this alliance building. An alliance building may be with the community or with the individual patient, frequently both. So for our example, we have a very robust community outreach and engagement program with tribes on a number of different issues: screening, education, events, so that when the concept of clinical trials comes up, there's been that alliance building, that true partnership. We do the same thing with the African American community, et cetera. You have to create that partnership. Then when the individual is there, you have to meet them in a language they understand and in an environment they're comfortable with. They have to trust you and your system. And you're going to do that by being open and honest, and then recognizing there may be some cultural barriers that you need to address. So for our institution, we have 3 American Indian navigators who are assigned to helping American Indian patients. Any American Indian patient that comes to our center is assigned an American Indian navigator who is their advocate and can help them deal with the healthcare system from their rural community, their tribe, coming to a large urban area, understanding the importance that they're going to get access to the best possible care. But that care isn't just the chemotherapy or the surgery, it's this holistic approach. Financial toxicity, social workers, psycho-oncology. And I think you guys are absolutely right. And everybody on that team has to say to themselves, like, our palliative care folks is an awesome group. They realize a lot of their job is to keep people on clinical trials, deal with their side effects, because that's important. There are also end-of-life issues, but that's not palliative care. Palliative care starts the day somebody gets diagnosed, and they're part of our clinical trials team. So I think you guys are spot on. And the question is, funding to create these types of holistic type approaches is just, it needs to be amped up a little bit so that you can do these types of community outreaches, create these alliances and partnerships, and then provide that more holistic approach that will create the trust that patients will then say, I'm appreciative of being able to be at a place where I can participate in a clinical trial. And that you've known you've done the right thing when you get to that point.
Let me add, can I add to that, if I may? I think those are very good points that need to be considered. One of the limitations, however, that we saw as we developed our community-based program was the fact that even though we established a lot of good programs for patients to come into our site, the patients did not want to leave their communities. And so we do need to urgently build the partnership with community practitioners. Sometimes they're oncologists, but sometimes they're the general practitioners because they are the ones that do the first diagnosis and actually take care of the patient once they come back home. So the surgeon most of the times diagnoses the first lump in the breast, or the OBGYN is the one who diagnoses the first cervical cancer, or things of that sort. We need to work with them. They need to be our partners. It's not just oncologists or surgical oncologists that can do this. So as part of that process, I know we've had focus groups both with patients and community practitioners, and patients say, we don't want to go to the big city. We don't want to go to New Orleans. That's a crazy place for us to go. So they prefer to stay at home. And so I think we need to facilitate the participation of the community practitioners. I think part of that is somebody mentioned, and I think it was Dr. Nassi, both the community outreach navigators, the community navigators that can help patients find a place where to go, and then the navigators or the trained research personnel. COVID has changed the landscape of our research personnel. They're being hired by droves by CROs because they're already trained by us. And so we need to find a way to train additional research personnel that can, in those community practices, play a role in facilitating the participation in clinical trials. The community physician is a busy individual, cannot spend too much time jotting down data or doing a lot of paperwork. That's why we need those trained navigators to help them do that. And I think we need to recognize that we're losing a lot of that research personnel to other opportunities. If we address that, I think community practitioners, and we facilitate their participation, community practitioners and community patients are more willing to participate, maybe not in the phase 1 clinical trial, but certainly in the phase 2 and other trials.
Additionally, Dr. Ochoa and Dr. Manol, it is important that the researcher, that the PI get out of their silo and go look. Go to these places that we're talking about because you have different eyes and you see differently than I do. I'm boots on the ground in the community. I'm that liaison between the cancer center and the patient particularly with the cancer center. It's so important that in order to, one, have an infrastructure that works, that one, the commitment be, as Dr. Manol is talking about, from the top down. Because without that commitment from the top down, willing to spend the money, willing to get their researcher, get their teams out into the community to do a service project. I know it, taking time away from clinic, one day, just one day, will change how the enterprise itself is going to look at what is possible with clinical trials.
So we're getting toward the end, and Dr. Bartas has had her hand up very patiently, and I'd like to give her a chance.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with everybody, and I do want to echo Dr. Ochoa's concern here. as we increase the number of patients that we accrue in clinical trials, our workforce volume of activities exponentially go up. And this does contribute to imbalance in the system, where we lose our study coordinators to the industry, and something has to be done about that. One of the things is actually leveraging on technology. The industry have been very good in their processes, and in academia, we're lagging a little bit behind on some of the softwares that's used to help do their jobs. The other thing too is if we want to really be very serious about precision medicine, I think that we have to make sure that because there's some disconnect there. Like for instance, for our PRMC, we need to put a lot of patients on trials. If the trials are not accruing, then they have to be closed, because their role is to close trials that are not accruing. But some of the trials that we have are on rare mutations, and therefore we don't expect them to accrue 5 patients a year. So there's some disconnect there. And of course, the patients in the rural area do not always get comprehensive gene panel testing. And again, that goes with education. So thank you.
So we have a few minutes left for some last comments. Innovative ideas that would help us. I take it, maybe I just ask all of you very briefly, is it a fantasy to think about doubling clinical trial accrual? Because it's not really the number of patients, it's the rate that we complete trials that is critical to making decisions, understanding whether new treatments will be effective or not. And so I'm really interested in your experiences, a lot of experience on this call. Is this something that we really should pursue?
It's absolutely not a fantasy, because there are examples where there's double the rate and more that is actually been achievable. It's looking at what are the key reasons, and I think there's many pieces that you've heard here. I do think there are things we can do about simplifying protocols and bringing more of the trials to patients, either through the community centres or for these rarer cancers, by activating sites when the mutation is found or when the cancer is found. And there are examples of both of those that we can use. But yes, it is doable. There are practical things that you've heard many examples of. If we implemented those systematically across the United States, I think you could exceed this target.
I totally agree with that. And, I have some practical experience too, as both a patient and advocate and a scientist in the rare cancer space. I have both funded clinical trial work as well as led to the work on generating data to inspire clinical trials. And we're able to get trials launched in cooperative groups where they had a distributed network baked into the system. Accrual stopped being an issue. And so there's, just like a head-to-head with individual sites versus a distributed network where you can accrue in exceedingly rare cancers already. There's already an infrastructure that could be leveraged and learned from.
I think one of the underutilized resources that we could bring to bear rapidly is our National Clinical Trials Network. With a doubling of funding, there could be a substantial increase in the number of patients on high quality, practice changing clinical trials. I know you know that, Jim. It's a resource limitation that needs to be addressed if you're really going to double the amount of patients going on clinical trials. And then an awareness that sites that are very effective at putting patients on clinical trials are probably putting in other resources other than the monies that they get from the clinical trials, such as philanthropy, healthcare system dollars. We have to elevate it so that the healthcare systems and philanthropy view this as a priority that they want to invest in.
So this is Augusto Ochoa again. I think this is absolutely doable. We increased our clinical trials participation tremendously by just expanding our programs into the community and finding champions in the community. They are eager to participate. and so are patients. But we do, I think we've heard several times, number one, I think we need to provide some research infrastructure for those sites that traditionally have been limited to the major cancer centers or to the academic cancer centers, such as research navigators and research nurses. But the other thing we need to do is we need to simplify some of our clinical trials, not in an early phase, but a later phase, and have them move on the level of complexity, data management, et cetera, that most clinical trials require today is impossible for a community practitioner. And so I think we need to simplify them also so that patients with comorbidities can also participate, because that is real life oncology. Most of our patients have comorbidities. I think those are some of the issues that I think would greatly increase participation. And yes, I do agree. I think it's doable.
I would argue, though, that early phase clinical trials are very important in the care of our patients, and therefore there should be equity in access to early phase clinical trials, including patients from rural areas, because the chances of these patients getting benefit from these therapies on early phase clinical trials are probably higher compared to some of the poor tracked standard of care that are available right now. So I would argue that I would include early phase clinical trial access to everybody.
So we're near the end of our time, and this has been just a wonderful conversation, and everyone's enthusiasm and commitment is just incredible. And I'd like to turn it back to Dr. Lowy.
Thanks. I really want to thank all of you and those of you who have been listening for your participation as well. To me, this discussion is very reassuring. It basically says, yes, this is possible. And if we can do this, it means that we can help cancer patients faster than we can right now. And that really is a major goal, both of the administration, the NCI, and all of us, as we want people to be able to live longer and healthier lives. Thank you very much.
U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute, cancer.gov, 1-800-4-CANCER.